Member for Vancouver Fairview.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And if it wasn't so inappropriate at a time when I'm actually getting up to speak to a bill, I'd be speechless based on some of the comments I just heard. And I want to say to the member from Chilliwack Hope, while I have immense respect for him as a person, I simply think he's wrong in his statement, a number of his statements. He's wrong in his statement that the science of climate change is still undetermined. I would suggest that perhaps during a boring moment in question period, the member for Chilliwack Hope might want to turn around and have a friendly conversation with the member for Oak Bay Gordon Head, who won a Nobel Prize for a reason. He won a Nobel Prize because he'd reviewed reams of scientific literature about climate change, about the fact that climate change is caused by human activity, and there is a reason that about 98% of the world's scientists are in agreement that climate change is a man-made phenomenon. It's worldwide, it's not a regional phenomenon, and it's a significant threat to the future health of the planet, the future well-being of many low-lying communities that are barely above sea level, but it's also a significant economic threat, as was pointed out by Sir Nicholas Stern, I believe, in the UK, that if we do not deal with this, there will be significant price to pay, economic price to pay, in many, many, many ways down the road. And in fact, Honourable Speaker, one of the problems with our current measure of gross domestic product is that it leads often to perverse assumptions about what is useful economic activity. In fact, that was perversely put forward by Kinder Morgan in their application for a pipeline, in which they said if there was an oil spill, don't worry, we'll employ people cleaning it up. I don't think most British Columbians would think that's the kind of useful economic activity that we should be supporting. So let me simply say to the member from Chilliwack Hope, in addition to my suggestion that he might want to review with the member from Oak Bay Gordon Head some of the very real, peer-reviewed science on this matter that is accepted worldwide, that there's a reason that this bill is called the Greenhouse Gas Industrial Reporting and Control Act and not the possibly a greenhouse gas and nasty pollution Industrial Reporting and Control Act. It's because for all the failures in this bill and all the questions I have about the government's approach to combating climate change and the slipping and sliding nature of the commitment, this government has in fact recognized that climate change is an issue. This government recognizes, I think, that many British Columbians want to hear what we're going to do to address climate change. So this government, as is its wont in very many endeavors, tries to tell the people of British Columbia what the people of British Columbia want to hear and need to hear. Unfortunately, as is also the government's wont, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors and not much substance to the delivery of the measures that British Columbians want to hear, need to hear. The assurances that British Columbians need and deserve, and in fact, people around the world need and deserve. Honourable Speaker, let me say that there are, in fact, tremendous opportunities with the development of natural gas and a liquid natural gas industry in British Columbia. People on this side of the House, my side of the House, agree with that. Where we differ with the government is the approach to developing it and the fact that we believe there are some very significant steps that need to be taken to make this a healthy industry, an industry that doesn't threaten the people of the planet in British Columbia with global climate change, and that actually can contribute in the form of transition fuels as we move to a low or no carbon future. So that is why on this side of the House we've said that if in fact liquid natural gas holds the promise in British Columbia for many, many jobs that there need to be guarantees of jobs and training opportunities for British Columbians, particularly benefits for First Nations. If this is going to be a good economic opportunity for British Columbia, then we need to ensure that British Columbia gets a fair return on our resource. And we need to ensure that that's concrete, that that's not a list of benefits on the one hand, and then a list of how we mitigate those benefits and hand them over to somebody else on the other hand. But for the purposes of this bill, which is about greenhouse gases, we say we need to protect our air, land, and water, and we need to do that by living up to our climate commitments and living up to them very clearly. Honourable Speaker, the Environment Minister has said in the backgrounder to this bill that, and I quote, "There is no point in establishing an LNG industry in BC if we can't protect the environment. We want to enable safe development with great environmental standards." Honourable Speaker, those are important words. They're the words that British Columbians want to hear. And so the minister and this government tells British Columbians what they want to hear. Unfortunately, Honourable Speaker, there is nothing in this bill that delivers on those commitments. During the convention of the Union of BC Municipalities, Honourable Speaker, I had the opportunity to sit in a room with a number of mayors from around the province who were discussing the actions they were taking, and we often see tremendous leadership at the municipal level from governments that take very concrete actions to address greenhouse gas emissions as well as other environmental matters. The minister, speaking to this group of mayors, indicated that it was going to be extremely difficult, all things being equal, to meet the government's greenhouse gas emission reduction targets by 2020 and 2050, and that it would be exponentially more difficult with the liquid natural gas industry. And one of the reasons for that, Honourable Speaker, is because while the member for Chilliwack Hope said that the proposal for a liquid natural gas industry in British Columbia was positing only about 13% of the greenhouse gas emissions of our neighbor Alberta with the oil sands, that's simply not true. That's true if we only have one plant, but if we have 5 plants, we'll have 75 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions. If we have 7 terminals, and let's bear in mind that the Premier has often spoken about a large number of potential projects going forward, has in fact staked the government's credibility on that claim. 7 terminals would produce 110 million tons of CO2 equivalent. The total from the oil sands is 90 million tons. 90 million tons. So it's important to set the record straight. The proposal for greenhouse gas emissions or CO2 equivalents from BC's natural gas industry will only be 13 million tons with 1 terminal. So it's important that Hansard not include a spurious fact. It's important that we in this House deal with reality. We deal with the truth. And that's, Honourable Speaker, one of the big problems with this bill. It talks about, and in fact the government prior to this bill talked about in its own strategy documents, and I'm quoting from the LNG Strategy Document 2012, that LNG development in BC will have lower life cycle greenhouse gas emissions than anywhere else in the world. In the Natural Gas Strategy Document of 2012, this was repeated. LNG development in BC can have a lower life cycle for greenhouse gas emissions than anywhere else. This will differentiate BC in the global LNG export market. This was all to sum up the promise that BC would have the cleanest life cycle emissions in LNG. What do we see more recently? What do we see in the Premier's most recent speeches? What do we hear from the Minister of Environment? What do we hear from this government? What do we hear in the throne speech? We talk about the cleanest liquefaction plants. The liquefaction plants that only cover 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the extraction of gas, the transport of gas, and the liquefaction of gas into LNG for export. Honourable Speaker, I want to repeat that we on this side of the House believe that in fact there are opportunities for BC with liquid natural gas and with natural gas generally. That's why the NDP government established the Oil and Gas Commission. And Honourable Speaker, we believe that liquid natural gas can in fact play a role in fighting climate change if it's used properly, if it's used as a replacement fuel, if it's used as a transition fuel. But we won't achieve the goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We won't achieve the goals of having the cleanest LNG industry in British Columbia if we deny that 70% of the GHG emissions associated with natural gas production are upstream emissions, which this bill does nothing to address. Now, in fairness, the minister has said we'll deal with that later. But that's not good enough, Honourable Speaker. If we're to take this bill at its word, in its title, a Greenhouse Gas Industrial Reporting and Control Act, then we and British Columbians have a right to expect that we will see not aspirational goals, not wishes and promises, not a kind of optimistic outlook on the future that says, trust us, we'll deal with those nasty 70% of CO2 equivalent emissions that occur from leaks, that occur from carbon dioxide emissions in the upstream formation, that occur from the flaring and the leaking of methane, which most people know is 5 times greenhouse gas intensive as CO2. Most people would believe that it's important to address those things, not pretend they don't exist, not pretend that they can be addressed later, and most importantly, not ask the people of British Columbia who are concerned about climate change to trust us. Because, as I've said, Honourable Speaker, we have a commitment not only to our children and grandchildren to ensure that we have a healthy economy in British Columbia, that we don't leave massive financial debts that, by the way, have been growing on a yearly basis, but that we don't leave a massive environmental deficit that not only threatens their food security, threatens the livability of British Columbia, threatens our security in British Columbia and around the world by the fact that many, many tens of thousands of people will be displaced by things that we already see occurring in other parts of the world, where there have been extreme weather events, flooding, and any number of other things that make their homes uninhabitable. We also will have a severely negative impact on other parts of our economy. We've seen the impact through pine beetle on forestry. We will see an impact on tourism. We will see any number of other things that impact the cost of our food. We've seen 3 years of droughts in California. We know that the growing areas in British Columbia will change with climate change. So, Honourable Speaker, if we're going to be honest about this being a generational opportunity, about LNG being a generational opportunity, then we need to make it so. We need to make this a generational opportunity by ensuring that as we develop liquid natural gas, we do it right. that we look at the total range of environmental safeguards and actions that should be contained in this bill to address greenhouse gas emissions. And we're explicit about that. We don't ask the people of British Columbia to trust us. We'll deal with 70% of the emissions later. We don't write a bill in which most of the detail will be introduced later by regulation, and some of the detail that's contained in the bill today can be wiped out later by cabinet regulation by a stroke of the pen. That we would actually talk very clearly about a vision that this government should have, but apparently does not have, about concrete measures that will be taken to address and mitigate the very real greenhouse gas emissions associated with the extraction, transport, and liquefaction of natural gas. Honourable Speaker, that's a reasonable expectation. I would love to be standing up here today and debating whether, in fact, the assumptions and the detail in a bill that outlined how we were going to do that were correct. But I can't, because they're not here and they don't exist, because this government won't come clean with British Columbians about what it actually intends to do. Honourable Speaker, this bill fails in a number of ways. A number of ways that would be critical for British Columbians, for us on this side of the House, even for the government's own members to understand how, in fact, we're going to develop a liquid natural gas industry and honor our legal, our legislated, our liberal legislated commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions so we can meet our climate commitments. If that were the case, Honourable Speaker, we would see a number of things in this bill that we simply don't see. We might see, for instance, a projection about what the greenhouse gas emission load of a liquid natural gas industry would be in a number of different scenarios. Powered by gas, powered by e-drive, if carbon prices were going to be placed on the process emissions of the gas industry, which they are not, which they have not been, which members on this side of the House committed to do in the last election and would have done if elected, which would have driven some technological change in the industry, as the carbon tax has driven in other parts of the economy. There might be that measure to talk about how, in fact, we intend, as legislators, to live up to the responsibilities that are contained in legislation that was passed in this House and that is the law of British Columbia, and yet we don't see that. I wish I could see that. I wish, in fact, that this bill contained some suggestions about how the provisions in the bill for LNG proponents whose plants are above an intensity level that this government points to as an indication that they are developing the cleanest LNG in the world, not life cycle LNG, I want to reiterate, but liquefaction LNG, that proponents that meet that target or come within striking distance of that target will receive some incentives, and others who exceed that target will have to deal with that by buying offsets or by contributing to a technology fund. Honourable Speaker, the problem with that scenario is the technology fund cost will be about $25 a ton of CO2 equivalent, whereas the current price for offsets is something like $9 a ton. Well, you don't have to really do the math, it's pretty obvious. People will revert to the offsets, but there's problems with offsets. We've seen, even as the member for Chilliwack Hope said in his remarks, that there were some questionable carbon offsets that were used to support the so-called carbon neutrality of government in the broader public sector, in the education sector, in the hospital sector. In fact, some offsets that were sold for a very high price, a price that might otherwise have been put into the education of young people in British Columbia, actually went to support projects that not only would have proceeded without the offset, they actually would have proceeded for a very good reason. They were saving the proponent money. Honourable Speaker, there are some offsets in British Columbia and around the world that are credible. This bill says that they'll be certified by a third party. Well, Honourable Speaker, I hope so, because the record of this government under the Pacific Carbon Trust was abysmal and was enough to make British Columbians cynical about the whole carbon offset system. Honourable Speaker, what would be more to the point if we want to be serious about meeting our legislated targets is, yes, have a penalty for excess greenhouse gas emissions, but also have a limit for greenhouse gas emissions. Have a cap. Have the kind of cap that was envisioned under a cap and trade system enshrined in legislation, which, by the way, this bill will repudiate and remove. Honourable Speaker, have some suggestions or incentives in the bill about what proponents of the liquid natural gas industry might do, could do, should do to specifically reduce greenhouse gas emissions so that British Columbians know that as we develop an industry that holds some promise for British Columbia's economy, that could hold some promise for lessened greenhouse gas emission reductions around the world, that we were doing that in a way that doesn't boost our own greenhouse gas emissions sky high in such a way that it will be, by the Minister of Environment's own admission very recently in Whistler, BC, make it all but impossible to obey the law that we in this House passed and that we in this House should take seriously and have a responsibility to ensure continues. Honourable Speaker, let's step back for a minute and assume that maybe the Technology Fund will receive some investments from people instead of buying carbon offsets. And that might well be a good thing, Honourable Speaker, and perhaps the Technology Fund should have been given equal prominence by ensuring that the penalty, whether it's an offset or the Clean Technology Fund, were equal. So there was an incentive, Honourable Speaker, for people developing the greenhouse gas industry, the liquid natural gas industry, to invest in a fund that actually develops technologies that are specified, that we talk about in this bill, that might reduce greenhouse gas emissions not only in this industry, but in many industries. Honourable Speaker, this government had a chance in this bill to put forward a vision, a holistic vision that said, we are going to develop liquid natural gas because it holds promise for British Columbia, it holds promise for British Columbians. It holds some promise and can play a role in being a transition fuel over the next decades as we move, hopefully, Honourable Speaker, to an era of reliance worldwide on renewables before we do exceed the 2 degrees of warming that the member from Chilliwack Hope may believe isn't imminent, but which a vast, vast majority in the 90th percentile of scientists believe is inevitable unless we make some serious change, like the ones at the UN. Honourable Speaker, a holistic view would have said, we're going to do this. We understand that there are emissions associated with this. We understand that there are measures A, B, and C that can be taken to lessen the emissions. We expect proponents, if they can't use in the initial stages because of capital-intensive development of this industry, some of these less greenhouse gas intensive technologies. This is what we expect them to do over time to phase things in, and there will in fact be increasing penalties if they don't do that, just as there was in the Liberals' initial carbon tax escalating over time to ensure that there is an incentive to in fact get there. And on top of that, Honourable Speaker, there are a number of other things that this bill could have, should have, assured British Columbians that this government is committed to in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There could have been, Honourable Speaker, a commitment to make a massive investment in public transit in Metro Vancouver and in improved transit in other parts of the province that over time will deal with one of the major causes of greenhouse gas emissions around this province, and that's transportation. Some people need to be in cars and trucks. We understand that. Not everybody does. But this government continues to refuse to use or even to consider using the carbon tax or even a new regional carbon tax with agreement of municipalities to invest in transit or, Honourable Speaker, to support and invest in a massive energy retrofit program for public buildings, for commercial buildings, for residential buildings. And, Honourable Speaker, nowhere in this bill do we see other commitments or other visions or other plans or other roadmaps that could assure British Columbians that as greenhouse gases rise through the creation of liquid natural gas plants, because they will to some extent, there is no way to produce liquid natural gas with no emissions whatsoever, that this government is committed to taking strong, concrete, and clear measures to build an economy in other parts of this province based on clean technology, based on carbon reduction, to offset the emissions in this industry that, as I've said, does hold promise for British Columbia. Instead, Honourable Speaker, what we see is a bill that tells British Columbians what British Columbians want to hear and need to hear. British Columbians, of course, respond positively to the notion that we will have the cleanest LNG industry in the world. Therefore, the Premier, the Minister for Natural Gas, the Minister of Environment tell British Columbians what they want to hear, but doesn't tell us how they're going to deliver. Doesn't take the measures necessary to ensure that we do deliver. Honourable Speaker, it's fine to promise, but a promise broken is worse than no promise at all. Honourable Speaker, you don't have to be a United Nations and Nobel-recognized scientist to know that there are things that we can do in British Columbia that if we start now will have a significant impact on greenhouse gas emissions and that will enable us to reduce those emissions. There are things we can do in developing a natural gas industry that can ensure that we don't miss our targets and that we do contribute worldwide to some change. But they're not in this bill, Honourable Speaker. The detail isn't in this bill. There is nothing in this bill that prevents the government through cabinet regulation from reversing the small number of promises that are contained in this bill, including the intensity level, which is simply a matter of a schedule that can be amended by cabinet regulation. Honourable Speaker, it's not good enough. Honourable Speaker, British Columbians deserve better. Honourable Speaker, we should be giving them a clear roadmap. As we develop this industry, we shouldn't be holding out false promises. We shouldn't be holding out empty bills. We should be giving clear direction to the industry and to British Columbians about how we are going to meet our greenhouse gas reduction targets, and this bill simply does not do that.